Thank you very much. May I start by thanking the organisers for inviting me to speak at this second Malta Graph Theory conference. As Josef has just said, I attended the first one back in 1990, and it's good to be back here again, celebrating the 75th birthday of my first research student, Stanley Fiorini. Today I'd like to take you back over more than 40 years to the mathematical and combinatorial world of Britain in the 1970s, and to describe how Stanley and I fitted into that picture. I first got to know Stanley around 1969 when he was studying mathematics for an honours degree in mathematics in Oxford. Later he became my PhD student at the Open University, receiving his degree in 1975 before returning to Malta. In 1977, he returned to Oxford for 6 months to write our joint book based on his thesis. And then in 1979, he visited the UK yet again to take up the post of staff tutor for the Open University, where he was based for 2 years in Bristol before returning finally to Malta. After that, my main contacts with Stanley were when he became head of the maths department here in Malta, and he invited me to visit as an external examiner for their undergraduate degree. As for me, I was then much slimmer than I am now. While completing a PhD thesis in number theory in the US, I came across the combinatorial work of Giancarlo Rota at MIT and quickly became hooked on this exciting new subject. I then returned to the UK and spent a year in Cambridge switching over to combinatorics and looking around for a job. Meanwhile, Oxford University were just about to introduce combinatorics into their undergraduate curriculum and needed someone to teach it. I obtained a 3-year position in Oxford teaching pure mathematics in general and lecturing and running classes on combinatorics and graph theory in particular. And following this, I moved to the newly founded Open University, which I'll tell you about in a minute, where I spent the next 37 years producing distance learning courses in pure mathematics. Stanley began his mathematics degree course in Oxford in 1968, being based at Greyfriars, shown here, then one of the constituent halls of Oxford University, and attending lectures at the iconic, though not particularly beautiful, Mathematical Institute. Incidentally, we have a fine new building now. I arrived in Oxford a year later, as I said before, by which time Stanley was just beginning his second year, and we overlapped there for 2 years. Stanley took his finals examinations in 1971 and returned to Malta. He attended the ceremony to receive his BA degree in 1973. So what was combinatorics like in Oxford then? The subject was just beginning to enter university curricula around this time, and the new second-year course at Oxford, initiated in 1969, consisted of 8 introductory lectures on basic combinatorics and graph theory, given by myself, followed by 8 lectures on optimization, given by someone else. I also taught tutorials and classes in combinatorics and graph theory, which Stanley attended, and over the 3 years that I was there, I gave several higher-level lectures and classes in graph theory. The combinatorialists in Oxford at the time were Dominic Welsh, quite an old photograph, who had designed the second-year course, and Aubrey Ingleton, who gave advanced lecture courses on combinatorics. And interestingly, 2 other Oxford contemporaries who attended the same lectures as Stanley and took finals at the same time were Paul Seymour, known to all of us, and Geoffrey Grimmett, now best known to undergraduates for his textbooks on probability. And talking of textbooks, these days we have large numbers of textbooks on combinatorics and graph theory to choose from, but at that time there were very few. In graph theory, apart from Koenig's first textbook published in 1936, the only ones available were those by Claude Berge in both French and English. Here's the English one. And Oystein Ore, published in America. While in combinatorics, the best-known books were probably those by Herbert Reiser and Marshall Hall, and also a then new text by CLU, which you can see in the middle there, which was the one used for the Oxford course. But things changed dramatically in 1969 with the publication of Frank Harari's eagerly awaited graph theory, on which many of us were brought up. But there were no inexpensive basic paperbacks on graph theory, which is why I wrote my introduction to graph theory, which soon became widely used and still sells well 45 years later in its current 5th edition. Don't forget to buy it after the talk. Meanwhile, combinatorics was developing in several other British universities, and in July 1969, Dominic Welsh organized a combinatorics conference in Oxford with 75 participants, and with Paul Erdős, Roger Penrose, and Mark Katz among its speakers. And this was followed in 1971 by a small invitation-only meeting at Royal Holloway College, at which Bill Tutt was the main speaker, and then by another larger conference in Oxford in 1972. And by this time, it was becoming clear that these gatherings should become more established, and this led to the founding of the biennial British Combinatorial Conferences, or BCCs, first in Aberystwyth in Wales in 1973, then in Aberdeen in Scotland in 1975, and so on. And incidentally, once you finish this week, the 26th BCC takes place next week, again in Scotland. Well, one of the great advantages of meetings such as this one is the chance to meet fellow combinatorialists. And here are several photographs taken 30 to 40 years ago of some of those in British universities during the 1970s who may be familiar to you. You may recognize such names as Douglas Woodall, Peter Cameron, Bela Bolabash, Norman Biggs, Donald Keedwell, Cedric Smith, Ian Anderson, Richard Rado, Keith Lloyd, and Crispin Nash-Williams, all taken, as I said, about 30 to 40 years ago. So let's move now to the second period of Stanley's time in Britain, and again, I'll have to give you some background. 1971 saw the opening of the British Open University, or OU, with 16,000 adult students working part-time and earning their degrees from home. This number later increased to over 200,000. The OU was based in Milton Keynes, halfway between Oxford and Cambridge, and about an hour's drive from Oxford. My Oxford lectureship was about to come to an end, and in 1971 I was invited to teach at one of the OU's mathematics summer schools, and much inspired by the enthusiasm of the adult students, I decided to apply to this new and exciting institution and was successful in getting a lectureship. Now, you'll recall that Stanley had taken his Oxford finals examinations in 1971 and had returned to Malta. But meanwhile, on joining the OU, I was encouraged by the then Dean of Mathematics, Maxim Bruckheimer, whom you will remember, to take on a research student. As I understand it, Stanley, who'd meanwhile kept in touch with me, was thinking along similar lines and visited Oxford to see whether this was possible. We met up, found that we were talking the same language, graph theory, and the OU found the money for him to become a full-time graduate student at the OU, working for a PhD in graph theory. So it was that Stanley returned to Oxford, where I was still living, and he and Joan found accommodation in Summertown House, recognize that, in the north of Oxford. Stanley used to accompany me on my regular car journeys to Milton Keynes, which gave us much time to talk about his developing research. So what did Stanley's researches involve? Well, my combinatorial interests had taken some time to settle down. With my interest in number theory, I was originally attracted to Rota's work on the Möbius function for partially ordered sets, but I also became interested in the eigenvalues of graphs, and in matroids, on which I wrote a survey article for the American Mathematical Monthly, for which I won a Lester Ford Award. I remember that, actually. I flew all the way to the States. It cost me $600 to fly to the States to receive this $100 award. But inspired by a sentence in Harari's graph theory book, which I'll show you in a minute, I also became interested in edge colorings of graphs, and because this is the subject that Stanley came to work on, I'd better tell you a little bit about it. So I'll get technical for a few minutes, but it won't be long, don't worry. If G is a graph, its edge chromatic number or chromatic index is the smallest number of colors needed to color the edges of G, so that adjacent edges, that's edges that meet at a vertex, are colored differently. And here you can see an example with chromatic index 4. It needs 4 colors to color the edges. And if you look at the vertex at the bottom, it's got 4 edges out of it. They must all be differently colored, so you need at least 4 colors. So you notice that the maximum degree is delta, here 4, then the chromatic index must be at least delta, but it may be more. Below you can see a brief history of the subject. Prior to the 1970s, the 5 most important papers on the subject are those of Tate, Koenig, Shannon, and 2 by Wiesing, as I'll be describing in my contributed talk tomorrow. Then there was the 1970s with Stanley and others, and then what happened after this will also be described tomorrow morning in the contributed talk by Bjarne Toft. But here's the extract from Harari's graph theory book that excited me. After presenting a result of Wiesing, that for a simple graph with maximum degree delta, the number of colors needed for the edges is either delta or is just one more, delta plus 1, Harari then wrote, "It is not known in general for which graphs this number is delta." And this question seemed worth investigating, and at a meeting in the US in 1971, I met Lowell Beinecke for the first time, and together we wrote an article in which we presented some known results and found a few new ones. I think it was quite an important paper at the time, although looking back on it, it does seem very, very elementary. But here are a few of the results. For a simple connected graph with n vertices and maximum degree delta, we stated Wiesing's result, and with exceptional insight, I named those with chromatic index delta graphs of class 1, and those with chromatic index delta plus 1 graphs of class 2. This was my main contribution to the subject, since this terminology has persisted. Lowell and I noticed also that of the 143 connected graphs with up to 6 vertices, only 8 are of class 2. They're very much the exception, and indeed a few years later, Erdős and I proved that in some sense most graphs are of class 1, a result that was substantially developed in a paper produced shortly afterwards by Bela Bolobash. Lowell Beinecke and I also presented lists of class 1 graphs and class 2 graphs, which you can see here, some of which I'll say more about tomorrow. But it was at this stage that Stanley joined in. He started as Open University researchers in the early autumn of 1972 and quickly adjusted to the task. Our first joint paper was for a meeting that I attended in Liège in Belgium and consisted mainly of a summary of my paper with Lowell Beinecke, together with a few new constructions by Stanley on so-called critical graphs. Stanley was to write a lot about these in the forthcoming year or two, so what are these critical graphs? In this context, a critical graph is one that's only just of class 2. That is, it's of class 2, so it needs the extra color for the edges, but removing any edge or any vertex lowers the chromatic index, giving a graph of class 1. And as with many other types of critical graph, such graphs have more structure than graphs in general, and more can be said about them, so they're worth studying rather than those in general. These critical graphs have been introduced independently by Wiesing, and then by Beinecke and myself, and also by the Danish mathematician Ivan Jakobsen, shown here, who wrote a fine paper about them around 1973, proving that for delta equals 3, there are no critical graphs with 4, 6, 8, or 10 vertices. This led him, as it had earlier led us independently, on rather less evidence, to formulate the critical graph conjecture that no critical graphs for any delta have an even number of vertices. Our second joint paper, written mainly by Stanley, was for the British Combinatorial Conference in 1973 in Aberystwyth. By this time, Stanley was fully into his stride and was producing many worthwhile results at great speed. And in this paper, he presented several quite technical results on critical graphs, including some interesting constructions for them, as shown here. The great thing about such conferences, such international conferences, is that we can meet many combinatorists from all around the world. And here are some combinatorists that I first met in the 1970s, and I think all but one of them are in this room at the moment. So see if you can recognize them after all this time. I won't embarrass them by naming them, but I think you will be able to recognize a few of them. Shall I tell you? Andrew Thomason, Chris Godsill, Cottoner, Leif Erikson, Josef Sharan, Harold Gropp, who can't be here today, Bjarne Toft, and Merritt Kubale. These are all photographs. I took these photographs many years ago and hid them away and suddenly discovered them. I thought it would rather be nice to show them. Meanwhile, back at the Open University, I was busy writing correspondence material and making TV and radio programs for our courses in real and complex analysis. So here's me in a gaudy shirt on television in 1974. We also arranged for a number of stars to visit the OU for a few days to work with OU members of staff, and here are Paul Erdesh, who came for a few days, and also Donald Coxeter. The people shown below are OU colleagues who won't mean much to most of you, but some of whom Stanley may remember. But all this time, Stanley was churning out excellent edge coloring papers at an astonishing rate. It was as much as I could do to keep up with his output, and in fact, I didn't. As you can see here, these included a paper on uniquely colorable graphs for the Quarterly Journal of Mathematics, one on edge coloring outer planar graphs for the Journal of Combinatorial Theory, and papers on critical graphs for 3 respectable journals: the Mathematical Proceedings of the Cambridge Philosophical Society, the Bulletin of the London Mathematical Society, and Discrete Mathematics. In the last of these, with Lowell Beinecke, he proved that there are no critical graphs with 10 vertices and no critical graphs with delta equals 3 and 12 vertices. And at the British Combinatorial Conference of 1975 in Aberdeen, Stanley and I described some applications of edge colorings to networks, scheduling, Latin squares, and tensor calculus, the last arising from work of Roger Penrose. Well, with all this activity, it wasn't long before Stanley could write up his results in his Open University PhD thesis on the chromatic index of simple graphs, which he submitted at the end of 1974, just over 2 years from starting work on the subject. The external examiner for his oral exam was Richard Rado of the University of Reading, and his internal examiner was John Mason, a former matroid theorist who has since become a world authority on mathematics education. Stanley was the Open University's first PhD in pure mathematics, and there have since been 3 other PhDs awarded to Maltese mathematicians. And in spite of the short time in which Stanley produced it, there was absolutely no question as to his quality, as to its quality. As Richard Rado commented at the time, "My only worry about this thesis is that the standard is so high that later OU doctoral students will find it difficult to do as well." Stanley's PhD degree was awarded to him at one of the OU's degree ceremonies in the summer of 1975. On the social side, in the summer of 1975, Stanley and Joan visited Chequers, the 16th century manor house that the Prime Minister of the day uses at weekends. The occasion was the christening of my twin daughters, who'd been born in March. Stanley and Joan then returned home, and Stanley rejoined the mathematics department of the University of Malta. By this time, the subject of edge colorings was rapidly expanding, with more and more graph theorists becoming interested in the subject, and for some time Stanley and I had thought about producing a research monograph on the subject. In 1977, Stanley and Joan returned to Oxford for 6 months to work on it, living in Iffley, a suburb of Oxford with its fine Norman church. They didn't actually live in that church, but if you come to Oxford, don't do what most tourists do and spend all the time in the colleges. Go 3 miles outside and see this absolutely magnificent Norman church. Also pictured here is some sort of social gathering, I can't remember where, perhaps you can remind me later, with Joan and Christina, and with me, my wife, and our twin daughters. Stanley also attended the 1977 British Combinatorial Conference at Royal Holloway College, where he spoke about a new interest of his, which is the reconstruction of graphs, of which you'll hear about tomorrow. With his usual ability for concentrated hard work, and with Stanley typing the whole manuscript himself, we were quickly able to submit the book, and it appeared in December, just in time for everyone to buy it for their Christmas reading. And here it is, in all its glory. As a reviewer commented, this very readable book is the first attempt to gather together all the known results in one place, and in presenting such a lucid introduction to the subject and a clear description of what the major peaks may well be, the authors, meaning Stanley in particular, are to be thanked for making the information so accessible. And incidentally, in the next year, Stanley wrote a bibliographic survey in the Journal of Graph Theory. The book had a huge bibliography of almost 200 entries, and in this paper, these are included with certain commentary. Well, for the last section of this talk, I'd like to look at Stanley's final involvement with the OU and with a later development in the subject. And this later development was the resolution of the critical graph conjecture, which had been unresolved when we wrote our monograph, but which was then known to be true for up to 16 and possibly 18 vertices. There are no critical graphs with an even number of vertices, and this is true certainly for up to 16 and possibly 18. But in January 1979, I received this letter from the Russian mathematician Mark Goldberg, to whom I'd sent a copy of the book. On the left is a picture of him with Wiesing. In this letter, he told me that he'd found an infinite family of counterexamples to the critical graph conjecture arising from certain graphs called snarks, which I'll tell you about in a minute. Here you can see one in the letter, and if you remove the two marked edges shown here, it gave one of his counterexamples, and in his letter, he very kindly awarded me this particular snark as a present. So if you ever use this in any of your papers, you need to pay me heavy royalties. So what's a snark? Essentially, it's just a regular cubic graph of class 2. So delta is 3, and 4 colors are needed for the edges. The name snark was ascribed to them by Martin Gardner, who, like me, was a great Lewis Carroll enthusiast. And in Carroll's poem, The Hunting of the Snark, snarks were mythical creatures that were hard to find, as these graphs were. The earliest snark was the Peterson graph in 1898. Then came the Blanusha snark, in blue to the right of it, in the 1940s, which also featured later on a Croatian postage stamp. There aren't many graphs that appear on postage stamps. But only 4 snarks were known up to 1973, and it was also in the 1970s that infinite families of them were discovered. And here at the bottom is the Goldberg snark in 2 drawings. And if you now replace the 3 blocks by 5, or any higher odd number, you'll get more snarks. And then if you remove the edges with arrows on them, you'll get his counterexamples to the critical graph conjecture. On the right, you can see Anthony Hilton and Mandy Chetwynd. In 1980, I'd taken on Mandy as a research student to work on snarks, but in the event, I became very busy with OU coursework, And meanwhile, Anthony had joined the OU for a short period, or was working at the OU for a short period, and he and Mandy started to collaborate on edge colorings. And this worked so well for all of us that he took over Mandy's supervision, leading over the next few years to a dozen or so excellent joint papers with her. So where does Stanley fit into all of this? In the summer of 1979, he and Joan returned to the OU, where Stanley attended the 1979 British Combinatorial Conference in Cambridge, and then spent 2 years as a staff tutor based at the Open University's regional office, regional centre in Bristol, from where his job was to, he was involved with the organisation of tutorial and class supervision for many hundreds of mathematics students in the southwest region, extending down to Devon and Cornwall. And here are some of his staff tutor colleagues who will no doubt remember. At that time, Stanley also took on an OU research student, a certain Joseph Lowry, working on the reconstruction of graphs. Meanwhile, I was leading a team that was producing a large-scale Open University Combinatorics course, which included over 1,600 pages of printed text, 16 nationally broadcast television programs. Anyone could turn on the television, anyone around Britain could turn on the television and watch programs about four-color problem and networks and block designs and all sorts of things. This course was very successful. It was studied over its 14 years by 6,000 adult students in total. And its successor course, first presented in 1995, is still running and regularly attracts some 300 adult students per year. Here are some of the original course team. You may recognize Rosemary Bailey on the left, who at the time was at the Open University. Also David Singmaster on the right, who was visiting. And those of you in Malta will recognize Fred Holroyd in the middle because he was also an external examiner here in Malta. Stanley was also involved with this course, and he contributed to 2 of the course texts shown here, one on selections and distributions and one on planarity and coloring. But after 2 years in Bristol, Stanley gave up his staff tutoring and returned to Malta in the summer of 1981, rejoining the university's mathematics department. So to conclude, may I just remind you that in tomorrow's historical talks, I'll be describing the edge colorings of graphs pre-Stanley, Bjarne Toft will describe edge colorings of graphs post-Stanley, and Joe Lowry will talk about Stanley's work on reconstruction and other topics such as topological graph theory and spectral graph theory. So it only remains for me to sign off and to wish Stanley a happy 75th birthday. And to present Stanley with an isomorphic copy of my tie, which incidentally has the word graph theory right in the middle of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robin. Now we have the other guests I mentioned. Dr. Gavin Gulia, he's the chairman of the Malta Tourist Association, and they helped us a lot with this conference. And he will start by addressing the participants, okay? And then the rector, the minister will be coming soon, and then a few words from Stanley.
Should I do it from here or from? No. That's all right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to start by thanking the organizers of this conference. May I introduce myself first and foremost? I'm the chairman of the Malta Tourism Authority. I've been chairman since 2013, and we're passing through some very exciting times in the tourism industry, which I will have occasion to explain in my address. I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me to address this esteemed gathering of delegates attending this conference in Malta. It is an honor and a privilege for me to be here. I must admit that when I was informed that I would be speaking before an audience of mathematicians from around the globe, I thought this could be a tricky one. I am a lawyer by profession, a category which is better known for juggling words and engaging in dialectical argumentation and engaging rather than solving equations. I am also a politician, like the Honourable Varis Bartolo, the Minister for Education, fresh out, both of us, from a general election held earlier this month. As usual, elections bring along an astounding array of figures, numbers, and percentages. I too spend time analyzing exit polls, monitoring projections, and counting my votes. But other than these brief moments where numbers take center stage in my life, I cannot say that I have any direct connection with the world of mathematics. Or so I thought, until I realized that in reality, we are all immersed in mathematics all the time. From the moment the alarm goes off in the morning to the time one switches off the bedside lamp at the end of the day. We are continuously putting mathematics in action. As the basis for all sciences and its practical applications, maths is present, often in a clandestine state, in everyday objects that we tend to take for granted. The watch I am wearing, the mobile phone, the laptop I used to prepare the speech, the car I drove to get here, this building, and 1,000 other things inside it and out, are all the result of mathematical genius and problem solving. The process from theoretical to concrete, from pure to applied, and eventually from the drawing board to the production line may be a long one. But there are very few things that I can think of which don't owe a huge debt of gratitude to the work of mathematicians. Even in my position as the chairman of the Malta Tourism Authority, I am surrounded by numbers and applied mathematics on a daily basis. The budgets that my organization plans and administers for marketing Malta around the world rely heavily on mathematics. The statistical analyst of tourist arrivals, expenditure, average length of stay, and many other performance indicators are all applied measurement techniques whose foundations are mathematical in nature. All our departments, from HR to IT, from finance to marketing, utilize tools, programs, functions, and formulas that are rooted in maths. If we had to say that without mathematics, none of us would get a paycheck at the end of the month, we wouldn't be far from the truth. Standing in front of you this evening fills me with confidence that for once at least, my audience will not be displeased to hear me speak of numbers and figures, numbers of which we are particularly proud in Malta. They are numbers which illustrate how the tourism sector in Malta and Gozo is quite literally booming. In fact, over the past few years, tourism to our islands has gone from strength to strength, with the year 2016 being the 7th consecutive year delivering overall increases for our tourism sector, and another year of records, inbound tourism increased by 10%, totaling almost 2 million. 2 million was the figure, was the target that we set for the end of this year, but we managed to anticipate that, and we did it at the end of last year. Besides this, a further 620,000 cruise passengers visited Malta, up 4% over the previous year. And perhaps more importantly, expenditure grew, with tourism contributing over 1.7 billion euro to the local economy, relatively to your countries, which may be bigger. This is very good for Malta, considering our very small size. But numbers alone are not enough. What matters most is that Malta is becoming a destination truly sought after by all ages and in every season. This can be seen in Malta's changing tourism profile. The biggest growth registered indeed in tourist arrivals last year was in the 25-44-year-old age brackets, followed by the under 24-year-olds. The island's growing appeal to a younger tourist is part of the change the Maltese tourism industry as a whole is undergoing. Moreover, this change is not taking place to the exclusion of other age brackets, which also continue to grow. The fact that arrivals are coming from an increasing variety of source markets and that tourism inflows are gradually spreading beyond the traditional peak summer months to the rest of the year are also trends worth mentioning. We are now halfway through the year 2017, which started off with an extremely positive first few months, and official data for the period January to April of this year points to another extraordinary performance, with the number of inbound tourists recording a double-digit growth of 22%, more than 22%, nearly 23%, reaching the figure of just under 550,000 tourists. This means that in the first 4 months of this year, there was an increase of over 100,000 arrivals over the same period last year. In addition to this, nights stayed by tourists and tourist expenditure mirrored the excellent performance and the number of tourists, resulting in an additional 58 million euro injection in our economy. What's it to us, some of you may ask? Well, many of you in the audience are visitors from overseas and now also form part of this success story. You too will be part of our numbers. Your arrival on these islands, your attendance of this conference, the economic benefits you will generate during the stay will become components of our tourism statistics. Something myself and my colleagues at the Malta Tourism Authority will brag about next year. But let me assure you, each and every one of you, that in Malta and Gozo, you will never, ever be treated as just another number. No matter how much we value our numbers, we always value the people behind them much more. Our tourism industry is based on the genuine hospitality of our people, on our human touch, where every guest is truly unique and deserves the best. That is the only way we can guarantee that our numbers will continue to grow in a healthy and sustainable way in the coming years. I conclude by wishing you all a successful and fruitful conference and a pleasant stay on our islands. Good evening.
I invite the Minister to join us. So if you can speak, so this is the Minister of Education, Mr. Alvarez Bartolo. I've already told you that they have. Yes, sit here, please. And after him, the rector will talk.
Well, I'm overawed to have to address you because I was hopeless at maths. My father was brilliant, and he couldn't understand how he gave birth to me. And I think one of the reasons why I was terrified of maths is because I was terrified of my father. And since then, and I have been trying to make sure that in our schools we try to get fear away from maths, because half of our students still find it difficult to cope with maths. And we are trying to find ways of making them maths friendly. I'm very happy to be here and to support this conference. I'm told that it's one of the biggest gatherings in this area in the world this year. I've tried to understand what you're going to discuss. I think I have given myself the illusion that I have understood a bit what it's about. Graph theory, I think I could understand. The other one was a bit more complex, though I think it's more useful for a politician. What I understand is that it helps you to see what people to choose in combination to work with each other. It's quite tough. It's quite tough for us to do that because we don't always get it right. And the voters don't always get it right either. So it's an interesting. Just a word, as I feel very happy to be here to pay tribute to Professor Fiorini. Professor Fiorini has done a lot of good work in mathematics, has done a lot of good work in history, and is a living example that the controversy of the two cultures is nonsense. You know, whether it's the culture of science and the culture of the humanities, or STEM, and as if this is in contradiction to the liberal arts. Knowledge is knowledge, and I think the world would be a much better place if we have STEAM, you know, if we have science, technology, arts, and maths, engineering, obviously, as well. But I think Professor Fiorini is a living example of this, that we need both, and especially I think that most of the problems that we faced in the last, definitely in the last, I would say 9 years, even since the financial crash, hasn't been a failure of knowledge, but it has been a failure of what to do with the knowledge that we have. And that I think, although that you are primarily involved in research, we should put research and education within the context also of what we do with that research, what we do with the knowledge that we have. And I'm very happy that even OECD finally is waking to the idea that knowledge, competence, and metacognition on their own are not enough, but there should also be the question of character. What do we ethically do with the research and with the knowledge that we have? So I really wish you well, and also a pleasant stay in Malta beyond the walls of this hotel. Thank you very much.
Dr. Gulia asks us to apologize him because he has a prior commitment.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Ciao. And now the rector, Professor Alfred Vella. He's a chemist, but we won't hold it against him. So here you are.
Thanks, Joseph. I am here principally not because I feel comfortable in the presence of mathematicians. They always make me a bit uneasy. And that used to also be the case when I had to chair for 11 years the board of the Faculty of Science as dean. And the mathematicians and worse, the statisticians always brought in all sorts of peculiar issues to the table that, that has formed my opinion firmly of mathematicians. So here we are, almost 200 of you, and I'm so alone as a chemist. Now, seriously, I'm here to show the appreciation of the university to the work that my colleagues in the Faculty of Science, Department of Math, are doing. I guess ever since Humboldt, almost 2 centuries ago, defined the universities as places where learning and research must happen together, it became an imperative that true universities were those that supported the research culture. In fact, I sometimes suspect that we may have gone a bit overboard, and only perhaps more recently are universities becoming again sensitive to the need to provide teaching and learning in a proper and caring setting to students. So much attention has been given to research and students sometimes being left floundering on their own. But anyway, that is not the main thrust of my message today. The main thrust this evening is for me to again show my appreciation of the work of research active colleagues typified by Stanley Fiorini and his colleagues, Joseph Lowry, and also the younger set of the department. I also see Anton over there, and not among the younger set, but one of the older set. And Irene probably is somewhere hidden around. There she is. There she is. This department has been extremely active even when some other faculties at university were still in a bit of a slumber with regards to research. And this despite the fact that this university is an old university, one of the older in Europe, 400 years plus. But of course, in the earlier centuries, perhaps, we could say, the attention, and before Humboldt, to be sure, the attention was more that of providing the professionals in the arts, in law. Gavin has just left, one of the products of the law faculty. As Minister Bartolo has mentioned, Stanley Fiorini is not only important to the university for his contributions to mathematics, but also as an historian, especially an historian of medieval Malta, about which there are not many writing and debating amongst themselves, and the debate can become occasionally quite hot, believe me. The university has shown its appreciation by granting to Professor Fiorini a rather rare status, that of Senior Fellow for Life. I think only 2 others have been accorded this status, and it did it also because Stanley went beyond the sort of norm, which is his background, mathematics and the teaching of and the production of research in that area, but also having ventured into this other area that is also important, even nationally. So, I thank you for being here. Please, well, of course, Joseph was saying earlier that this is the second Malta Mathematics Conference in a period of almost 30 years, was it? 28 years, almost 30 years. So I'm sure it is not the only vehicle that Maltese mathematicians have to meet with fellow experts in the area. But anyway, if you are here and therefore facilitating communication with our mathematicians, experts in this area, it is adding to, let's say, the value of these kind of conferences. But please, can we not wait another 28 years for number 3?
I won't be able to support it.
That's right. That's right. So, again, I want to reiterate what my colleague, Minister Bartolo, said. Don't just, now that you're here, don't just stay simply doing business while you are on the island. Do venture and see what there is to enjoy. Unfortunately, the heat is a bit too much, but I can assure you it was similar in Rome yesterday, and probably in London also. Anyway, at least we have the sea that Rome does not have so close to the old town. Do enjoy the island, and please come back in order to make Gavin happy by increasing his tourist arrival numbers soon. Thank you.
Stanley, maybe would like to say something?
Thank you, Joseph. Honourable Minister, Rector, colleagues, friends. Having heard Robin's version of the story, it is now my turn to fill in the blanks in this Apologia Pro Vita Sua. You will bear with me to consult my thoughts in black and white, as my memory of late has started playing tricks on me, and I do not want to end up saying something silly. If I had to give a title to what I want to say, I'd call it Reminiscences. Yes, it was thanks to Robin, back in the 60s as an undergraduate at Oxford, that I became enamored of and seduced by the fascinating theory of graphs and combinatorics. I was then living in dire straits of poverty, and never dreamt that I would be able to pursue the subject researching at doctoral level, not with the funds available to me then. But Providence has its own ways. After graduating back in Malta, lecturing at junior college, our 6th form, in the company of Irene Shiriha, I learnt of the opportunity to attend a graph theory conference being held at St. Andrews, which the then Royal University of Malta was prepared to sponsor me for. I thoroughly enjoyed it. There was Tony Hilton, if I'm not mistaken. I was mistaken about the other assertion. And there was Frank Harari, who was preaching one of the courses. It fired my imagination. At the end of the conference, I said to myself, while in the UK, why not drop in at Oxford to say hello to old friends? This I did and met Robin again, and as he told you already, he offered me an OU scholarship to work with him for a PhD. That was in August. Come October, I was now back in Oxford digging my teeth into Wiesing's theorem and edge colorings. By December, I had come up with, to my mind, some significant conclusions when I got the shock of my life, an experience I would not want any one of you to have to go through. Ambling back from college to my digs one evening, it suddenly dawned on me that there was one fatal flaw in the argument on which the whole edifice was constructed, and the whole Tower of Babel came tumbling down. I experienced a great attack of nerves. My tongue felt heavy as lead, and so did my limbs. My landlady, the good Mrs. Cooper, came to the rescue with her panacea, a good cup of English tea. It steadied the boat no end. Back in Malta for Christmas, I got married to Joan, and in January we were both back in Oxford ensconced in Summerdown House, as you've heard already. She was a pillar of strength for me. I was then expected to produce a long essay on an unrelated topic, not combinatorics. Someone wanted to test my writing skills. I had chosen Galois theory. In those early days, when the Oxford University computer on Banbury Road filled a whole large room and photocopying facilities were a rarity, John and I used to spend long evenings at the Maths Institute in St. Giles, with me identifying relevant abstracts in maths reviews, and she, in her very neat teacher's hand, faithfully copying out reams and reams for me to digest in the comfort of home the next morning. Joan also proved very useful as my sounding board. Her patience was endless. I used to try out my thoughts on her. It was all Greek to her, but it helped me no end to focus. All conversations started out the same in Maltese, ikollok graf. Here I would like to share with you how I got my inspirations. Every Sunday, John and I would walk down Squitchy Lane to go to Mass at a church on Woodstock Road. The homilies were usually quite tedious, and I would immediately switch off and fly to psychedelic edge-coloring land. No sooner was Mass ended when I used to rush Joan home to put it all down on paper quickly while it was all still fresh in my head. Conceived in the holy place, you may say that my thesis was quite inspired. Our daughter Christina could not have arrived at a more appropriate time, that is, soon after I had submitted my thesis. Otherwise, it would have been disastrous for me to try and concentrate with a squealing infant in our small flat. Back in Malta, after graduation, I had then begun lecturing at the university. Starting from scratch, I began building a combinatorics and graph theory group around some elective lectures in the final year BSc. At the time, Joseph Lowry had begun his master's. Our then rector, the late Professor Edwin Borg-Costanzi, was very encouraging, even allowing me to go on an early 6-month sabbatical in Oxford, during which I began veering towards reconstruction problems. On my return, I managed to seduce Lowry to start a PhD working on reconstruction. We were then riding on the crest of a wave when dark clouds began looming on the horizon. That time, the British were pulling out of Malta, and our university soon lost its royal title. I correctly read the writing on the wall, and in 1978 decided to leave the island on an exchange with Lance Leeson of the OU, who was then staff tutor in the Bristol office. It was for me a new and challenging but interesting and fruitful experience in administration, running the OU maths program in the southwest of England, from Cheltenham in the north to the Scilly Isles in the south. For a second time, the OU proved to be for me my fairy godmother. The maths department arranged a scholarship for Lowry to enable him to come over to the UK and complete his PhD with me. Those were very good days. Remember, Joseph? Strolling in Bristol, discussing reconstruction, mulling over ideas and tidying up results in the evening, even over the phone. I could easily have stayed on at the OU, but upon mature reflection, I realized that I was exiling myself from something that was very dear to me, my home island. I felt like a homing pigeon, irrevocably attracted to the nest where it was hatched. I pined for home, in the full realization that Malta in the early 80s was no Garden of Eden. The university in particular was going through a very dark patch. The maths department as we knew it had ceased to exist, and its sole raison d'etre had become servicing functional courses of engineering, architecture, and education, with the same courses being repeated twice a year. There was no room for research. However, I argued within myself, with Lowry around, I'll be able to pursue researching in spite of everything. But Lowry had by then started busying himself with very necessary administrative tasks. The upshot was that when I needed him most, he was not there. For very good and pressing reasons, admittedly, but graph theory had to play second fiddle. Without going into any details here, it was a soul-destroying period in my mathematical career. But, like Winston Churchill, the optimist in me tried to change a time of crisis into one of opportunity. I was not going to spend my time twiddling my thumbs. I had returned to Malta to discover my roots. I wanted to rationalize the irrational Homer pigeon instinct and attraction to my hatching nest. Inspired by our medievalist historian, the late Gottfried Wettinger, I began digging into my past, the past of my family, the past of my people. I began accumulating a lot of highly relevant historical material. In the meantime, the climate for the flourishing of combinatorics and graph theory had changed for the better, enough to restart undergraduate and graduate courses. Interest among the staff rekindled, and I was still surviving, mostly living off the fat that I had accumulated. Time was ripe for me and Lowry to organize an international conference. The first Malta Graph Theory and Combinatorics Conference in 1990, which was held in a hotel just round the corner from here. The number of participants was roughly half that of the present conference. Soon after this, for 8 years between 1994 and 2002, I had been chosen head of department, a role that permitted giving direction to mathematics, both in teaching and in research. My historical interest by now had begun competing with my mathematical research, which I was pursuing mostly through collaboration with students and colleagues. Time, the thief, was pressing, and I had to take drastic decisions. Over the years, I had collected important material which I could not just keep for myself and take it to the grave with me. It was crying to see the light of day. I did not have to, but I decided to retire at age 65 purposely and precisely to be able to publish this material before moving on to better pastures. So there you are, in a nutshell. You have my academic career. I can only conclude by saying how honored, humbled, and touched I am by this gesture on the part of my colleagues, who, out of appreciation for my small contribution, thought of dedicating this conference to me on my 75th anniversary. I want to mention them by name, in strictly monotonic, increasing alphabetic powers. Peter Borch, John Baptist Gauci, Joseph Lowry, and Irene Shiriha. I thank them most heartily, and I thank you all present, coming from all four corners of the planet, auguring an enjoyable and fruitful week in Malta, albeit a somewhat hot one. Wishing you all, as one is wont to say on such occasions, that no one comes up with any counterexamples to any of your theorems. Enjoy and thank you.